Revolution bookstore in New York City, which I invite all of you to, and yes, it's a revolutionary communist bookstore. And so maybe I have some of your experience from before, but from your previous experiences here. But I think we agree here, just to go referencing Marx, we agree here, I will say one thing first. This is one of the first workshops I've been to where at least the question of radical transformation of society, not radical, but revolutionary transformation of society is in the room. And that's very important because a good deal of this conference is in a different framework. And we won't get very far if we just dwell on that, but I think it is important that you noted it at the beginning. Now, as I said, revolutionary communist bookstore. We agree, I think, with many people here that what we're aiming for is a society, the abolition of all classes, not just the upper classes, but all classes. That's something that you said. 2, all the social relations that correspond to those classes. This is from Marx, right? In terms of the way that gender and race and all this stuff has become concentrated and reflective of, so that predates class development in terms of capitalism. But this is things that we have to start. All the institutions that correspond to it and all the ideas that reflect that and reinforce it. Now, the problem that we have, and one of the things I think we have to talk about, is that at the current moment in history, capitalism is even more than in Marx's time, really an integrated global production process. You know, we say often to people in training them about to understand some things. If everybody in the room would take off everything that wasn't made here, well, that would be a different picture. So we can't do that. So if you're talking, one of the questions I wanted to ask you guys to, I just have 2 questions and 2 things to address. One question is, once you start thinking about production on a global scale and outside of a relatively small community numbering even up to a few thousand people, you right away encounter the question of commodity production and the fact that will re-engender class polarization and in fact will develop institutions, including structures, that will be oppressive to people. And this is where you end up with the contradiction, which is a contradiction of how to get to a class of society, and the thing which we actually fundamentally disagree about, although I think we can work together on it, is the need for a revolutionary state to actually eliminate the state. And I understand certainly your personal experiences with a profoundly non-revolutionary state in former Yugoslavia is possibly influencing your opinions on all this. So that's one question on actually how you actually avoid class polarization and the replication of capitalism if you start from that smaller model. The second thing I want to point out to in terms of any discussion on this is actually a look at the Cultural Revolution in China. Actually, one point you made about Bolivia, which had to do with Eurocentrism in communist and Marxist theory as well as anarchism.
No, those were anarchism.
But certainly there, and a failure to look at an attempt to prevent the restoration of capitalism that was, in fact, one of the most emancipatory periods in human history that was, in the end, defeated. Okay? And then we must, if we're going to be serious about revolution, look at our defeats very seriously and not and say, well, that failed, now I'll move on and do something else. This is a big problem in all the social movements. And to this end, and I know here we go, the question of a leader, I would recommend, because too many anarchists I've talked to have never looked at what Bob Avakian has done as the leader of the RCP. Is there actually a re-envisioning, a re-evaluation on the tremendous emancipatory achievements of those first revolutions and a profound critique and a new way of going at some of these questions. And so, while we might be starting from profound differences, if you don't engage that, I'm done. Just if you don't engage that, then I think, really we're not going to get very far on this.
Sure. We will take one more question, and when we can answer that, we will have to go because it's almost 2 o'clock.
Okay, thought we could do a couple more questions, but I guess we can.
Yeah, it seems like I do a lot of work in queer theory with other of my, I guess, social anarchist comrades, and one of the things that it really criticizes is binary thinking, and we think a lot about, you talk about constructing this larger umbrella, or broader movement of libertarian socialism, combining aspects of social anarchism and left-wing and libertarian forms of Marxism. And I'm thinking maybe that we're leaving some things out, and I was wondering if you guys could talk about perhaps adding radical queer theory, various feminist theories, various articulations of critical race theory, radical environmentalism, for example, where we seem to have broad agreement among a number of different perspectives, regardless of the ideological nomenclature, about the necessity of prefigurative politics and antagonism towards hierarchical authority and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if we could maybe broaden the discussion a little bit, or if you guys have ever done any thinking about maybe trying to pull together some of this stuff, which is just, I guess, some of the theoretical work that some of us do.
Excellent. Shall we stop here and then answer the questions?
We have time, or do you want to put on?
There's a lot of people want to talk.
Yeah, we talk.
Okay, let's take
I'm
one
not
more.
Yeah, I just want to echo what this gentleman said, because I've been sitting here feeling the same way. I feel like almost the conversation is inverted. And I think a lot of what you brought up early on has been dropped, because all of, like, when I look back at the history of social movements in this country and around the world, all of the victories have been social, and they've all been informed by this theory, but none of them have been run by it. Like feminism, queer theory, like all that stuff is where the big changes have happened in our society, starting with civil rights, like moving straight through. And we're not those people. Like, and one of the reasons is I feel like we're just not dealing with the needs of the people in our communities. And with the inclusion of indigenous politics, the history, most of the people I work with, many of them just have no history of indigenous organizing. Much of which happened within the borders of the United States, with the Haudenosaunee creating their own passports, forcing the Geneva Convention to look at what happened in the U.S. with genocide, and the building, like the Zapatistas, like all that stuff builds on a network of indigenous people that have been organizing globally, separate from this to some degree, often informed by Marxism, often informed by anarchism, but it's just, that stuff needs to be included, and looking at how we can affect our immediate communities, doing direct action. I mean, there's positive examples just here in the U.S. that get completely ignored. Catholic worker movement, I mean, has Catholic attached to it, but they're a successful community of anarchist action. In the LC, the Atlantic Led community, the same thing. They've been for decades just doing direct action, community building, and the original Greens movement before it was taken over by the electoral politic. One of the most positive anarchist organizing experiences. The closest I've come to movement building with anarchist theory in the U.S. was that movement, all inspired in part by what's going on with Zapatistas, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the kind of thing, like, how do we get back to those? Like, how do we become part of these movements that happen beyond us? We can't just keep the rhetoric. Like, it's just, theory's not our problem.
Yeah, I think one thing that has to be really pointed out in anarchist praxis is that you have to recognize that what you're proposing is a new form of government. You're not calling it the state. You're calling it by a different name because its content is different. But some make the mistake that it is no government, and they won't take state power, so-called. This was the mistake of the Spanish Revolution in '36. They don't want to contaminate their hands. They don't want to take power. And I think what's necessary is a psychological move towards a self-definition by anarchists that we are libertarian socialists and go beyond the rather infantile stage in which we're saying we're against all government, and unfortunately the term anarchist is often associated with simple negation of government, and that absolutely has to go. Oh, and once you throw that aside, it'll be a lot more easy to work with revolutionary Marxists, not by betraying our position, but by clearly articulating a way to get to power. And I think one of the worst ideas is that we're going to achieve power through building countercultural organizations. Let's get real. A guy wants to set up a bookshop and run it on volunteer labor. He's not setting up government. He's setting up a bookshop within a capitalist system, and that just simply he has all of its labor donated for free. That's not the same thing as taking power. And we have to make a distinction and stop making excuses and saying, we're trying to establish government by setting up these countercultural experiments. No, we have to actually take power and have a means to do so. There are many ways to do it, party, etc. But that just that one psychological change from this kind of infantile anarchism to mature libertarian socialism
Sure.
has to be
I think that we
achieved.
get the point.